cat after too little sleep. A volunteer handing out clothing. A harbour worker keeping movement flowing. A wounded soldier being moved away from the quay. A train waiting to take men onward. A town absorbing the shock of war arriving directly at its edge. If you're just joining us, this is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. You are listening to part 4 of our little ship's story. We are remembering not only the crossing from Dunkirk, but the arrival home through harbours like this one. The journey did not end at the water's edge. After landing, men had to be moved inland. They needed rest. They needed medical attention. They needed reorganization. They needed to be counted, directed, and sent onward. The evacuation was not tidy. It could not be. It was too large. Too urgent. Too improvised. But it worked. Not perfectly. Not without loss. But enough to change the course of what followed. And that is why Ramsgate's reception matters. Because a rescue does not only need boats. It needs places to land. It needs people ready to receive. It needs systems that can absorb shock. It needs towns that can become temporary gateways between war and home. Ramsgate became one of those gateways. Look again at the harbour. The boats today may sit quietly. The gulls may call. The tide may move gently against the wall. But in 1940 this same harbour carried a different sound. Engines. Footsteps. Orders. Coughing. Metal. Water. Voices. Maybe silence too. The silence of men too tired to speak. That silence is part of the story. Not every moment of history is loud. Some of it is quiet. A man sitting with a blanket around his shoulders. A cup held in both hands. A stare across the water. A thought he cannot finish. That is why the harbour matters. Because places hold what people cannot always say. In May 2026, when the little ships return to Ramsgate, visitors will see the vessels. They will see the flags. They will see the displays. They may hear music around the harbour. They may see families walking where exhausted men once came ashore. That contrast is not wrong. It is part of remembrance. Life continues. Harbours return to peace. Children walk where soldiers once landed. People take photographs where history once moved too quickly to be understood. But remembrance asks us to see both layers at once, the Ramsgate of today and the Ramsgate of 1940. The harbour view. And the human arrival. The festival. And the cost behind it. That is why this story belongs on Royal Harbour Live. Because the camera does not only show the present. It gives us a place to think about the past. If you are watching from another part of Britain, or from another country, this harbour is not just scenery. It is a witness. It witnessed vessels leaving. It witnessed men returning. It witnessed the town responding. It witnessed exhaustion, fear, relief, and survival. And when the little ships come home again in May 2026, they will return to a harbour that remembers. There is something deeply fitting about that. The vessels return not to a random marina. Not to a neutral backdrop. But to Ramsgate. A harbour that played its part. A harbour that received thousands. A harbour where the story came ashore. As Operation Dynamo continued, more men would be rescued. More ships would cross. More families would wait for news. More exhausted soldiers would pass through ports along the south coast. Ramsgate was one part of that wider effort. But it was a real part. A vital part. And for thousands of men, it was the first place where rescue became real. The moment a man stepped ashore, he was no longer only escaping. He had arrived. That arrival deserves to be remembered. Not just the departure from Dunkirk. Not just the crossing. Not just the boats. but the coming home. Because coming home is where survival becomes visible. If you're just joining us, you are watching Ramsgate Royal Harbour. This is Royal Harbour Live. And this is part 4 of our little ship's story. We have followed the harbour's past. The beginning of Operation Dynamo. The little ships themselves. And now, the return of men through Ramsgate. Part 4 is about the human landing. The moment when the sea journey ended, and the next chapter began. For some, that next chapter meant rest. For others, hospital. For many, reorganization and return to duty. For the country, it meant something larger. Britain had been shaken. But it had not lost its army. That fact changed everything. The evacuation did not end the danger. But it preserved the possibility of continuing the fight. And in that possibility, Ramsgate had a place. The harbour helped. The town helped. The people helped. And thousands came home through this water. When you look at the harbour now, let that stay with you. Not as a slogan. Not as exaggeration. But as memory. This was a place where rescue became a rival. You have been listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this has been part 4 of our little ship's story. Stay with us. Because next, we look at the legacy of Dunkirk, Ramsgate, and the little ships returning home in 2026. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 5 of our little ship's story. Memory returning home. By June 1940, Operation Dynamo was over. Against expectations, 338,226 Allied servicemen had been evacuated from Dunkirk. The beaches had emptied. The crossings had slowed. The boats had returned. And across the south coast of England, the harbours that had carried the operation began to fall quiet again. But history does not leave places so easily. Long after the noise fades, places remember. And Ramsgate remembers. Look at the harbour now. The calm water. The stone walls. The boats resting against their moorings. Visitors walking the quayside. Gulls turning in the wind above the marina. At first glance, it can seem peaceful. Almost timeless. But history sits here quietly. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Quietly. Because this harbour once stood inside one of the great emergencies of the Second World War. For a few extraordinary days in 1940, Ramsgate became part of something much larger than itself. A working harbour on the Kent coast became one of the vital lifelines in the evacuation from Dunkirk. Men left from here. Men returned through here. Small boats worked from here. And 42,000 servicemen came ashore here during Operation Dynamo. That fact remains part of the harbour, whether spoken or not. If you are just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. You are looking out across Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to the final chapter of our little ship's story. A story not only about war, but about memory. One of the remarkable things about Dunkirk is the way it survived in public memory. Not simply as a military operation, but as a national story. A story repeated across generations. Retold in books, films, conversations, school lessons, family memories. And harbour towns like Ramsgate became part of that memory too. But memory can sometimes smooth away complexity. It can turn difficult events into neat symbols. That is why remembering carefully matters. The evacuation was not simple. It was not tidy. It was not guaranteed to succeed. The men waiting on the beaches were in real danger. Ships were attacked. Boats were lost. The larger naval and merchant vessels carried much of the burden. The East Mole became essential. And the little ships became part of a much wider effort involving sailors, soldiers, harbour workers, volunteers, civilians, planners, engineers, and receiving towns. That fuller truth does not weaken the story. It strengthens it. Because it reminds us that survival often depends on many different people doing necessary work at the same time, and Ramsgate was one of the places where that work became visible. The harbour did not become famous because it sought attention. It became important because geography, engineering, seamanship, and circumstance placed it inside history at exactly the moment it was needed. That is often how history works. Not through destiny. Through readiness. A harbour built over generations suddenly becoming essential. Ordinary vessels suddenly becoming extraordinary. Ordinary people suddenly carrying historic responsibility. That is one reason the little ships still matter. They represent the moment when everyday life was pulled into national survival. Pleasure craft. Fishing boats. Motor launches. Workboats. Vessels built for ordinary purposes suddenly crossing towards danger because the moment demanded it. And the harbours that supported them became part of that same transformation. Ramsgate was not merely watching the story of Dunkirk. It was participating in it. That matters. Especially now. Because time changes the texture of memory. The men who fought in the Second World War are passing from living memory into historical memory. The people who witnessed Dunkirk directly are fewer each year. Which means places like Ramsgate become even more important. The harbour becomes an archive. Not of paper, but of presence. The walls remain. The water remains. The shape of the harbour remains. And through those things, memory survives physically. That is why remembrance matters in places like this. Because memory attached to real geography feels different. More grounded. More human. This is not an invented setting. Not a reconstruction. Not a film set. This is the real harbour. The same harbour that helped receive exhausted servicemen in 1940. The same harbour that prepared small craft for the crossing. The same harbour where people waited, worked, worried, and responded. If you are watching from another country, this harbour may simply look beautiful. And it is beautiful. But beauty is not the whole story. Places can carry beauty and burden together. That is true of Ramsgate. And perhaps that is why the harbour feels different once you know what happened here. The water stops looking empty. The silence stops feeling simple. The view acquires another layer. Memory changes landscape. If you are local to Ramsgate, this is part of your town's inheritance. Not ownership. Inheritance. A reminder that ordinary towns can find themselves connected to extraordinary moments. And that history is not only made in capitals, headquarters, and famous buildings. Sometimes it happens on quaysides. At harbour walls. At railway stations. Inside working communities by the sea. That is part of what Dunkirk revealed. Not only military endurance, but civilian involvement. Practical courage. Improvisation. Collective effort. The little ships became symbols partly because they represented ordinary life entering history. And people recognized themselves in that. A small boat. A harbour worker. A volunteer. A mechanic. A sailor. A town helping where it could. That is a very human kind of history. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live in Ramsgate. You are listening to the final part of our little ship's story. We are reflecting not only on what happened in 1940, but on why it still matters now. In May 2026, the little ships are expected to return to Ramsgate once again. More than 25 vessels are expected across the commemorative period. Some are due to arrive from the 15th of May. The main public commemorations are planned across the 22nd to the 25th. Selected ships are expected to open for public visits. And along the harbour, 338 silhouettes will stand in remembrance of the men brought home during Operation Dynamo. That return matters. Not because old boats are automatically important, but because memory needs physical connection. A photograph can inform. A book can explain. A documentary can teach. But standing beside a real vessel changes something. You realize the scale, the size of the hull, the narrowness of the deck, the exposure to sea and weather, the reality of crossing open water in wartime conditions. The boats stop being symbols and become real again. That is one reason commemorations matter. Not to glorify war, but to reconnect memory to reality. To remind people that history happened to real human beings in real places. And Ramsgate is one of those places. The return of the little ships is therefore more than a maritime gathering. More than a festival. More than a tourist event. It is a form of remembrance carried by water. The vessels return across the channel not simply as surviving craft, but as witnesses. Wood remembering. Steel remembering. Engines remembering. Harbours remembering. And perhaps people remember through them. Look at the harbour tonight. Or this morning. Or whenever you are watching. The light may be changing across the water. The tide may be moving slowly against the walls. The boats may rock gently in the marina. It can feel very far from war. And that is good. Harbours should know peace. But peace becomes more meaningful when we understand what came before it. That is one of the deepest lessons of Dunkirk. Not triumph. Not glory. But endurance. Survival. Continuation. Britain did not win the war at Dunkirk, but it survived the moment when defeat seemed dangerously close. And survival created the possibility of everything that followed. That possibility crossed this water too. Through Ramsgate. Through Dover. Through the small boats. Through the larger ships. Through the East Mole. Through exhaustion, uncertainty, and determination. The story belongs to all of them together. That is why accuracy matters. Because truth honors people properly. Exaggeration can make history louder. But honesty makes it stronger. And the true story of Ramsgate is already powerful enough. A harbour shaped over centuries. A harbour built for refuge. A harbour drawn repeatedly into national events. A harbour that became one of the lifelines in Operation Dynamo. A harbour that received thousands of returning servicemen. And a harbour that still remembers. That is enough. More than enough. If you are watching Royal Harbour live from somewhere else in the world, you are now connected to that memory too. The camera does more than show scenery. It creates witness. It lets people across the world look into a harbour with a living historical memory. That is something rare. Most places lose their stories beneath modern life. But sometimes a place keeps both. The present and the past together. Ramsgate is one of those places. As our little ship's story comes to its close, remember this. The boats mattered. The crossings mattered. The rescue mattered. But so did the harbours. So did the towns. So did the people waiting to receive those who came home. History is rarely carried by heroes alone. Usually it moves through networks of ordinary people doing necessary things under extraordinary pressure. That was true in 1940. And perhaps it is still true now. The little ships return in May 2026 not only to remember the evacuation itself, but to remember the communities connected to it. The harbours. The coast. The crews. The civilians. The returning servicemen. And the fragile line between danger and safety crossed over this water. That line once reached Ramsgate. And because it reached Ramsgate, Ramsgate became part of the story forever. You have been listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this has been our little ship's story. From the making of the harbour, to Operation Dynamo, to the little ships, to the men returning home, and finally, to memory itself. Thank you for listening. And when you look across the harbour now, remember what this water once carried. You're listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is the story of the little ships. In May 2026, this view will change. More than 25 Dunkirk little ships are due to gather here. Some are expected in from Friday the 15th of May. The main commemorative programme runs from Friday the 22nd to Monday the 25th. Selected vessels will be open for timed visits across the weekend. And along the quayside, 338 life-sized silhouettes will stand in remembrance of the men brought away in 1940. But before that weekend arrives, this is where the story begins. Not with the crossing. Not with the beaches. Not even with the order to evacuate. It begins with this harbour. At first glance, a harbour can seem like scenery. Stone. Water. Boats. Railings. Sky. But a harbour is never only scenery. It is a decision made in masonry. It is an answer to wind, tide, danger and distance. It tells you what a town had to survive, what it traded with, what it feared, and what it hoped for. And that is the first thing to understand about Ramsgate. The harbour you are looking at now was not simply built for pleasure. Long before the modern marina, long before the cafes and the walkers and the holiday photographs, this was a place shaped by the sea's bad temper and by England's need for refuge. Ramsgate began as a much smaller place than the town we know today. For centuries it was a coastal settlement shaped by fishing, farming and sea trade. The sea was not a backdrop to life. It was the road, the workplace, and the risk. The decisive change came in winter. On the 16th of December, 1748, a violent storm struck the Downs. Ships tried to escape. Ships needed shelter. And Ramsgate provided it. Lives were saved. And after that storm, something changed. The idea of a proper harbour of refuge here began to take hold. Not a small harbour. A serious one. A place where ships in danger could get under protection. Work began in 1749. But this was not quick. It was not simple. It became a long, stubborn, complicated engineering effort that lasted decades. Because building a safe harbour here was not easy. The sea fought back. Silt clogged the basin. Water movement had to be understood, not just resisted. And this is where one of the great names in British engineering enters the story. John Smeaton. His solution was simple. And brilliant. Use the sea itself. Let the harbour fill at high tide. Then release the water to scour the basin clean. So this harbour is not just walls holding water back. It is a system. A machine. Built from tide and stone. That matters more than it seems. Because in 1940, this harbour would once again depend on movement. On flow. On getting people in. And out. Quickly. By the late 18th century, Ramsgate had already become something much bigger than a local harbour. It had been tested. Improved. Strengthened. Because this stretch of coast demanded a refuge. And long before Operation Dynamo, Ramsgate had already learned how to matter. If you're just joining us, this is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you're listening to the story of the little ships. The civilian vessels that helped rescue over 338,000 Allied servicemen in 1940. War would come back to this harbour. In the First World War, Ramsgate became a base for naval patrols and minesweepers. By the time the Second World War began, it was already a known strategic harbour. Not a backup. Not an afterthought. A working asset. At the start of the Second World War, the harbour was closed, It became part of Britain's defensive system. Mines. Patrol boats. Control operations. This was no longer a peaceful harbour. It was preparing for war. And then came May 1940. Germany's advance was fast. Relentless. Unexpected. Allied forces were cut off. Ports fell one by one. Boulogne. Calais. Gone. Leaving Dunkirk as the last escape point. This was the moment everything changed. Operation Dynamo began. Not as a perfect plan, but as an emergency response to disaster. The beaches at Dunkirk were shallow. Large ships could not get close. Men were stranded. Exposed. Waiting. And this is where the small boats became essential. The little ships. Fishing boats. Pleasure craft. Civilian vessels. They could reach where larger ships could not. But the truth matters here. The rescue was not just the little ships. Large naval vessels carried the majority. The East Mole became a lifeline. Everything worked together. Navy. Merchant ships. Small boats. Air cover. And receiving harbours like Ramsgate. And this is where Ramsgate's role becomes clear. Not the biggest ships. Not the most famous ships. But the right ships. And the organisation to support them. 42,000 men were landed at Ramsgate. 42,000. Men arriving exhausted. Wet. Cold. Disoriented. And the town responding. With food. With clothing. With help. With humanity. Ramsgate was not just infrastructure. It became a place of reception. A place of return. And at the beginning of Operation Dynamo, no one knew how it would end. Churchill feared perhaps only tens of thousands might be saved. The first day rescued only around 8,000. It did not look like success. It looked uncertain. Fragile. At risk of failure. But history had other plans. Look at the harbour now. Calm. Quiet. Almost still. But once you know this story, you see it differently. These walls. These piers. These waters. They were ready. Not by chance. But because they had been built, tested, and used for generations. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. And you are listening to the story of the little ships. You have been listening to part 1. When the little ships return here in May 2026, you are not just watching boats. You are watching history return to the harbour that helped bring them home. The boats are expected from the 15th of May. The main commemorative days run from the 22nd to the 25th. And the 338 silhouettes will stand here through to the 28th of June. Stay with Royal Harbour Live. Because up next, the story continues. Operation Dynamo begins. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 2 of our little ship's story. Operation Dynamo begins. By the end of May 1940, the situation in France had become desperate. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, had been forced back towards the coast. The roads were crowded. Communications were strained. Ports were falling. And the army was running out of space. Dunkirk became the last major route out. Not because it was safe. Not because it was ideal. But because it was still possible. Across the Channel, at Dover, planning had already begun. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay and his team understood that if the army was to be saved, it would have to be brought home by sea. The operation was given a code name. Operation Dynamo. It was not a perfect plan. It could not be. There was no time for perfection. It was an emergency answer to a collapsing battlefield. On the 26th of May, 1940, the order was given. The evacuation began. At first, expectations were low. Very low. There were fears that only tens of thousands might be brought home. Perhaps 20,000. Perhaps 30,000. Possibly 45,000 if everything went better than expected. Nobody knew that the final number would become 338,226 Allied servicemen. Nobody standing in Ramsgate, looking out across this water, could have known that. Nobody at Dover could have known it. Nobody waiting on the beaches at Dunkirk could have known it. At the beginning, there was only urgency and uncertainty. The first day was slow. Around 8,000 men were brought off. That may sound like a large number now. But against the scale of the army waiting on the coast, it was frighteningly small. The beaches were exposed. The harbour at Dunkirk had been damaged. The skies were dangerous. And the sea itself created a problem. Large ships could not simply come close to the beach and collect men. The water was too shallow. At low tide, the distance was even worse. Men had to wait. They had to form lines. They had to wade out. They had to climb aboard whatever could reach them. This is where the small boats became essential. Not because they could do everything. They could not. But because they could do something the larger ships could not do. They could get closer. They could move between beach and larger vessel. They could ferry men through shallow water. They could create a link. A fragile link. But a vital one. And that is where Ramsgate comes into the story again. Because Ramsgate's role was not simply to watch events unfold across the channel. Ramsgate became part of the machinery of rescue. Nearly 2,000 officers and men were brought into Ramsgate from other ports. The harbour was prepared for the small boat work that Operation Dynamo demanded. Heavier craft operated from other ports too. Dover, Folkestone, Margate. But Ramsgate had a special part in the small boat side of the evacuation. That distinction matters. Because history is stronger when it is honest. Ramsgate did not carry the whole rescue alone. The little ships did not carry the whole rescue alone. But without places like Ramsgate, and without the small craft that could work in shallow water, the rescue would have been far more difficult. The story is not smaller because of that. It is bigger. Because it was not one harbour. Or one type of ship. Or one group of men. It was a layered effort. Naval ships. Merchant vessels. Small civilian boats. Harbour workers. Sailors. Soldiers. Airmen. And towns like Ramsgate, suddenly pulled into one of the most urgent operations of the war. If you are just joining us, you are watching Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to the story of the little ships. The harbour in front of you was one of the vital lifelines in the rescue from Dunkirk. Across the channel, the men waiting at Dunkirk were not waiting in comfort. They were exhausted. Many had been retreating for days. Some had little food. Some had little sleep. They were under threat from the air. They could hear explosions. They could see smoke. And they were looking towards the sea. The sea meant danger. But it also meant home. Imagine that. Behind you, the enemy advancing. Above you, aircraft. Around you, thousands of men. Ahead of you, water. And somewhere beyond that water, Britain. For many men, the journey home began with waiting. Waiting in line. Waiting for orders. Waiting for a ship. Waiting for darkness. Waiting for the next attack. The evacuation did not happen in one clean movement. It came in waves. Attempts. Failures. Adjustments. More ships. More boats. More urgency. At Dunkirk, the East Mole became one of the most important features of the entire operation. It was not designed as a passenger pier. But it became a lifeline. Large numbers of men were taken off from there. Destroyers and other vessels could load more efficiently from the mole than from the open beach. That was crucial. But the beaches still mattered. And the small boats still mattered. Because men were spread out along the shore. Because shallow water remained a barrier. Because every possible route had to be used. Operation Dynamo was not neat. It was improvised. It was pressured. It was dangerous. And it was constantly changing. The little ships became part of that changing answer. Some were pleasure craft. Some were fishing vessels. Some were motor boats. Some were lifeboats. Some had civilian owners involved. Others were taken over and crewed by naval personnel. They were different sizes, different shapes, different levels of seaworthiness. But together, they became part of the story. And this is where the phrase little ships becomes so powerful. Because it sounds almost gentle. Almost innocent. But what they were asked to do was anything but gentle. They crossed dangerous water. They worked under threat. They carried men who had been pushed to the edge of defeat. Some made repeated trips. Some were damaged. Some were lost. Some returned with men packed wherever they could fit. On decks. In cabins. In every available space. And when those men came back across the channel, places like Ramsgate had to receive them. Look again at the harbour. Imagine it not as it is now. Not calm. Not quiet. But busy. Urgent. Crowded. Boats arriving. Men coming ashore. People moving quickly. Orders being shouted. Volunteers helping. Food and clothing being gathered. The wounded needing care. The exhausted needing direction. This harbour became a place of arrival. A place where men who had expected capture, or worse, found themselves back on English soil. 42,000 men landed at Ramsgate during Operation Dynamo. 42,000. That number is almost too large to picture. So picture one man instead. Wet through. Cold. Hungry. Still trying to understand how he had made it back. Then picture another. And another. And another. Until the harbour becomes a river of returning men. Ramsgate did not just receive soldiers. It received shock. Relief. Fear. Exhaustion. And survival. This is the human part of the story. Not just ships. Not just numbers. People. The men on the beaches were people. The crews on the boats were people. The harbour workers were people. The townspeople helping with food and clothing were people. And that is why this story still matters. If you are watching from somewhere far away, this view may look peaceful. A harbour on the Kent coast. Boats. Lights. Water. But in May 1940, this water carried one of the great rescue efforts of the Second World War. And in May 2026, when the little ships return to Ramsgate, they return not as museum pieces alone. They return as witnesses. Wood. Steel. Engines. Ropes. Decks. All carrying memory. The event this May is not simply about looking at old boats. It is about remembering what those boats represent. Improvisation. Courage. Duty. Survival. And the extraordinary use of ordinary things. Because that is one of the deepest lessons of Dunkirk. Ordinary vessels became extraordinary. Ordinary harbours became vital. Ordinary people found themselves part of history. Operation Dynamo continued. More vessels were called in. More men were brought off. The number rose day by day. What had first looked almost impossible began to change shape. The rescue was still dangerous. Still uncertain. Still incomplete. But it was growing. The first day had brought around 8,000 men. Then more came. And more. And more. With each crossing, the chances improved. With each ship loaded, families back home gained hope. With each arrival at ports like Ramsgate, the impossible became slightly less impossible. But this was not victory in the simple sense. The army had lost equipment. France was still collapsing. The war was far from over. The men had escaped, but Britain now faced a darker future. That is why Dunkirk must be understood carefully. It was not a triumph over the enemy. It was a rescue from disaster. And yet, rescue matters. Survival matters. A nation keeping its army alive matters. Without the evacuation, Britain's future in the war would have looked very different. The men brought home from Dunkirk would become part of the country's continuing defense. They were not just rescued from the past. They were returned to the future. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. You are looking at Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to part 2 of our little ship's story. Operation Dynamo has begun. The beaches are full. The small boats are needed. And Ramsgate is becoming one of the receiving harbours for the men brought back across the channel. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to rush straight to the famous image. The small boats. The heroic crossing. The miracle. But the truth is more powerful when we slow it down. Because before it became legend, it was confusion. Before it became memory, it was fear. Before it became a symbol of British resilience, it was a desperate operation with no guarantee of success. That is what makes it powerful. Not that success was certain, but that it was not. The men who crossed from Ramsgate and other ports did not know they were entering a legend. The men waiting at Dunkirk did not know they were part of a story that would still be told more than 80 years later. They were simply trying to survive the next hour. The next tide. The next crossing. The next attack. That is the truth beneath the legend. And when the little ships return here in May 2026, that truth should come with them. Not as noise. Not as spectacle only. But as remembrance. The harbour will be busy again. Music. Markets. Visitors. Families. Photographs, people walking the quayside. Children seeing the boats. Older people remembering stories they were told. And somewhere underneath all of it, the deeper memory remains. This was a harbour that helped. A harbour that received. A harbour that mattered. As Part 2 comes to a close, Operation Dynamo is no longer just a plan. It is moving. The ships are crossing. The boats are working. The beaches are waiting. And Ramsgate is no longer simply ready. Ramsgate is involved. In the next part of our story, we move closer to the little ships themselves. The vessels. The crews. The risks. The crossings. And the extraordinary effort that turned small boats into lasting symbols of courage. You have been listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this has been part 2 of our little ship's story. Stay with us. Because next, the little ships take center stage. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 3 of our little ship's story. The little ships take center stage. By now, Operation Dynamo was moving. The order had been given. The evacuation from Dunkirk had begun. Across the channel, men were waiting on beaches, on roads, near the harbour, and around the town. Behind them was the advancing German army. Above them was danger from the air. Ahead of them was the sea. And across that sea, on the English side, harbours like Ramsgate were becoming part of the rescue. Not as scenery. Not as background. But as working places in a national emergency. The rescue needed large ships. It needed destroyers. It needed merchant vessels. It needed naval command. It needed the East Mole at Dunkirk. But it also needed something smaller. Something that could move where deeper ships could not. Something that could come close to the beaches. Something that could act quickly in shallow water. It needed small boats. That is where the little ships entered the story. The name sounds gentle. Almost affectionate. Little ships. But there was nothing gentle about what they were being asked to do. These were not all warships. Many were ordinary vessels from ordinary lives. Pleasure cruisers. Fishing boats. Motor launches. Lifeboats. River craft. Sailing barges. Workboats. Boats built for weekends, for rivers, for fishing grounds, for local trade, for harbour work. And suddenly, they were being drawn into one of the most dangerous operations of the Second World War. Some crossed with their owners. Some were taken over and crewed by naval personnel. Some were handled by men who knew every sound their vessel made. Some were handled by men who had to learn fast. There was no single little ship story. There were hundreds of them. And that is what makes the story so powerful. It was not one heroic boat. It was many. Different shapes. Different engines. Different crews. Different risks. All pulled towards the same purpose. If you are just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. You are looking out across Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to the story of the little ships, the small vessels that helped connect the beaches of Dunkirk with the larger ships waiting offshore. To understand why they mattered, picture the problem. The beaches at Dunkirk were wide and shallow. At low tide, the water pulled far away from the sand. Large ships could not simply come in and collect men like passengers at a pier. They would run aground. They would be exposed. They would be targets. So the men waited. Some stood in long lines. Some waded into the water. Some tried to reach boats under fire, and the small craft became a bridge. Not a bridge of stone. Not a bridge of steel. A moving bridge. A bridge made of hulls, engines, oars, ropes, courage, and timing. The little ships could move closer to the beach. They could take men off in smaller groups. They could ferry them out to larger vessels. And sometimes, they could carry men all the way back across the channel. That does not mean they did everything. They did not. The rescue depended heavily on larger naval and merchant vessels. The East Mole carried a huge part of the evacuation. But without the smaller boats, the shallow beaches would have been even more difficult. The little ships filled the gap. And sometimes, history turns on gaps. The gap between the beach and the ship. The gap between defeat and survival. The gap between being trapped and being brought home. That was the space the little ships entered. Imagine one of those vessels leaving the English coast. Perhaps from a harbour like this. Perhaps from another port. The crew knows the sea. But this is not an ordinary crossing. There is no pleasure in it. No holiday purpose. No calm destination. They are heading towards smoke. Towards noise. Towards a coastline under attack. The channel itself is not a small thing. Even in good weather, it demands respect. In wartime, it became something harsher. There were mines. There was aircraft attack. There was shellfire near the beaches. There was confusion. There was fatigue. There was the constant fear that a small vessel might not return. And yet they went. That is the heart of the little ship's story. Not that they were large. Not that they were powerful. But that they went. There is a kind of courage that looks grand from a distance. Flags. Uniforms. Ceremony. Music. But there is another kind of courage that looks like a small boat pointing its bow towards danger. That is what we are remembering. Across the water at Dunkirk, the men waiting to be rescued would have seen all kinds of vessels approaching. Some large, some small, some official-looking, some almost unbelievable in that setting. Imagine standing on the beach. You are tired. You have been retreating. You do not know if the next attack is coming. You look out and see boats approaching. Not enough. Never enough. But something. Something moving towards you instead of away. For a man on that beach, a small boat did not look small. It looked like a chance. One trip. One place aboard. One more step towards home. The work was repetitive. Dangerous. Physically exhausting. Load men. Move out. Transfer them. Return. Load again. Move again. Return again. Some boats became overloaded. Some were damaged. Some had engines fail. Some had to be abandoned. Some were lost. But the work continued. And here is something important. The story of the little ships is not just a story of vessels. It is a story of usefulness. A boat that had been used for leisure became useful. A harbour that had been built over centuries became useful. Local knowledge became useful. Seamanship became useful. Calm judgment became useful. In a crisis, usefulness becomes heroic. If you are watching the harbour now, you may see yachts, fishing boats, workboats, and marina lights. Most days, they are part of ordinary coastal life. But the story of Dunkirk asks us to imagine ordinary coastal life being suddenly called into something extraordinary. That is why this story still grips people. Because it suggests that history is not only made by governments and generals. Sometimes history reaches into ordinary places. A harbour. A boatyard. A marina. A fishing community. A riverside mooring. And it says, you are needed. Ramsgate understood that. This harbour had already known storms. It had known military movement. It had known naval work. It had known the practical demands of the sea. So when the evacuation demanded small boats and organization, Ramsgate was not starting from nothing. It had the shape of a place that could respond. And the response mattered. 42,000 men landed here at Ramsgate during Operation Dynamo. Think of the harbour receiving them. Not one dramatic arrival. But wave after wave. Men coming ashore. Some silent. Some dazed. Some relieved. Some injured. Some barely able to take in what had happened. Behind each number was a face. Behind each face, a life. A family. A fear. A future that might have ended on a beach in France. The little ships helped bring those futures back within reach. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live in Ramsgate. You are listening to part 3 of our little ship's story. We have reached the moment where ordinary vessels become part of an extraordinary rescue. There is a phrase people often use about Dunkirk. The miracle of Dunkirk. It is understandable. The final number rescued was far beyond early expectations. But when we use the word miracle, we should be careful not to make the human effort disappear. Because men planned this. Men sailed this. Men loaded the vessels. Men repaired engines. Men signaled. Men waited. Men returned. Women and civilians helped receive, feed, clothe, and care for those who came back. If it was a miracle, it was a miracle made of work. And the little ships were part of that work. Day after day, the evacuation grew. More ships. More small boats. More crossings. More men lifted from danger. The operation did not become safe. It became possible. That is the difference. And sometimes possible is enough. At Dunkirk, the small boats were used to move men from the beaches to larger ships offshore. Some made direct crossings. Others worked as ferries between sand and ship. Some were used again and again until they could do no more. They were small enough to reach places others could not. But being small also made them vulnerable. A small boat under aircraft attack has little protection. A small boat in rough water has little margin for error. A small boat overloaded with soldiers has little room for mistakes. Yet the crews kept working. There must have been moments when the noise was overwhelming. Engines, aircraft, shells, shouted orders, water against hulls, men calling out, metal striking wood. The confusion of many vessels trying to do urgent work in dangerous conditions. And still, through that confusion, the evacuation continued. This is one reason the little ships became symbols. They represent more than transport. They represent the moment when the scale of the crisis forced every available thing into service. Not perfect vessels. Available vessels. Not ideal conditions. Actual conditions. Not certainty. Resolve. Look again at the harbour. The shape of it. The piers. The water. The moorings. The working edges. This is the sort of place that helps us understand the little ships. Because a harbour teaches patience. It teaches weather. It teaches maintenance. It teaches that small details matter. A rope. A tide. An engine note. A mooring line. A decision made quickly. In wartime, those small details could become the difference between life and death. As the evacuation continued, Britain began to understand that something remarkable was happening. At first, the fear had been that only a small portion of the army might be saved. Then the numbers grew. Tens of thousands. Then more. Then more again. But for the men involved, it was never just a number. It was a crossing. A landing. A cup of tea. A blanket. A train. A message home. For many, Ramsgate was part of that first return to safety. Imagine arriving here after Dunkirk. The English coast beneath your feet again. The harbour around you. People helping. The war not over. Not even close. But for that moment, you were back. That is why remembrance matters. Not because the past is pretty, but because it was costly. In May 2026, when the little ships gather again in Ramsgate Royal Harbour, people will come to look at them. They will take photographs. They will admire the polished wood. The lines of the hulls. The flags. The history. But the deeper question is this: what did these boats once mean to the men who saw them coming? To us, they may look charming. To the men at Dunkirk, they may have looked like life. That is the bridge we need to cross in memory. From display to meaning. From event to understanding. From harbour view to human story. And that is what Royal Harbour Live can do. It can let people watch the harbour not just as a place of beauty, but as a place of memory. If you are watching from outside Ramsgate, this view is your connection. If you are local, this is your town's story. If you are visiting for the Little Ships weekend, this is your invitation to look deeper. The little ships did not act alone. But they gave the evacuation one of its most enduring images. Small boats moving towards danger. Small boats bringing men away. Small boats proving that size is not the same as significance. That is why they matter. That is why Ramsgate matters. And that is why the return of the little ships in May 2026 is more than a festival. It is a homecoming of memory. As Part 3 comes to a close, the little ships have taken their place in the rescue. The beaches are still dangerous. The larger ships are still essential. The East Mole is still carrying thousands. But the small boats have entered the story now. And once they enter, they are never forgotten. You have been listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this has been part 3 of our little ship's story. Stay with us. Because next, we come home with the men who returned through Ramsgate. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 4 of our little ship's story. Coming home through Ramsgate. By now, the little ships had entered the story. The small boats were working. The larger ships were still crossing. The East Mole at Dunkirk remained one of the vital routes out. And across the channel, the evacuation continued under pressure. But every rescue has 2 sides. There is the leaving. And there is the arriving. For the men brought away from Dunkirk, escape did not end the moment they stepped onto a boat. They still had to cross the channel. They still had to survive the sea. They still had to reach England. And for many, that first English harbour was Ramsgate. Look at the harbour now. The water. The piers. The quayside. The quiet movement of boats. Now imagine it in 1940. Crowded. Urgent. Exhausted. Alive with movement. Boats coming in. Men being helped ashore. Orders being called. Volunteers moving quickly. Food being found. Clothing being handed out. The wounded needing care. The exhausted needing somewhere to stand, sit, or simply breathe. This harbour became more than a landing place. It became a threshold. Between danger and survival. Between France and home. Between fear and the next uncertain chapter of the war. 42,000 men landed at Ramsgate during Operation Dynamo. 42,000. That number is too large to feel all at once. So imagine one man. Wet through. Cold. Salt on his clothes. Smoke still in his memory. The noise of Dunkirk still in his ears. He steps ashore. And for the first time in days, perhaps longer, he is back on English soil. Then imagine another. And another. And another. Until the harbour becomes a human tide. Ramsgate received not just soldiers. It received shock. Relief. Hunger. Pain. Silence. Confusion. Gratitude. And survival. If you are just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. You are looking out across Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to part 4 of our little ship's story. The crossings have brought men back across the channel. Now Ramsgate must receive them. This is the part of the story that can easily be missed. People remember the beaches. They remember the small boats. They remember the phrase, the miracle of Dunkirk. But after the crossing came the landing. And after the landing came the human work of receiving men who had been pushed to the edge. Some arrived injured. Some arrived without proper equipment. Some arrived in clothes soaked by seawater. Some had lost friends. Some had seen things they could not yet speak about. Some may have been too tired even to understand that they were safe. Safe. But not finished, because the war was still waiting. Dunkirk was not the end of Britain's danger. It was not a victory in the ordinary sense. Much equipment had been lost. France was still collapsing. Britain now faced the threat of invasion. But the men had returned. And that mattered. A country can replace equipment. Slowly. Painfully. But it cannot easily replace trained men. The evacuation brought back soldiers who would become part of Britain's continuing defence. That is why the arrival mattered so much. Every man stepping ashore was not only a survivor of the past few days. He was part of the future. And Ramsgate was one of the places where that future came ashore. Try to picture the town around the harbour. Not as a postcard. Not as a holiday scene. But as a town suddenly carrying the weight of history. People would have known something serious was happening. You could not hide an arrival on that scale. The movement of vessels, the movement of troops, the urgency in the streets, the sound of engines, the sight of exhausted men, the need for food, clothing, care, and direction. A harbour town understands arrival. But this was different. These were not holidaymakers. Not fishermen returning from a normal working day. Not passengers stepping ashore from a routine crossing. These were men coming back from disaster. And the town responded. Local people helped provide food. They helped with clothing. They helped with practical support. That matters. Because history is not only made in command rooms. It is also made in kitchens, in church halls, on quaysides, at railway stations, in the hands of people passing a blanket, a drink, a coat, or a word of comfort. In a national emergency, kindness becomes part of the operation. Ramsgate's role was practical. But it was also human. The harbour gave access. The town gave reception. If you are watching the harbour now, you may see only quiet water. But beneath that quiet is memory. A memory of movement. A memory of return. A memory of men stepping from boats into a country that had not yet won the war, but had not lost its army. There must have been moments of strange contrast. A man who had just left Dunkirk standing near the same harbour walls where, in peacetime, visitors might stroll. A soldier who had slept in ditches or on roads now being handed food by someone from the town. A young man who had expected capture suddenly hearing English voices around him. Imagine the emotional force of that. Not celebration. Not yet. More like disbelief. Relief mixed with exhaustion. Survival mixed with grief. Because many did not come back. And those who did return often carried the weight of those who had not. The story of Ramsgate in Operation Dynamo is therefore not only about numbers. Though the numbers matter. 42,000 men landed here. 80,000 in the Isle of Thanet. 338,226 Allied servicemen evacuated in total. But numbers are only the frame. The true picture is human. A man helped ashore. A sailor still alert after too little sleep. A volunteer handing out clothing. A harbour worker keeping movement flowing. A wounded soldier being moved away from the quay. A train waiting to take men onward. A town absorbing the shock of war arriving directly at its edge. If you're just joining us, this is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. You are listening to part 4 of our little ship's story. We are remembering not only the crossing from Dunkirk, but the arrival home through harbours like this one. The journey did not end at the water's edge. After landing, men had to be moved inland. They needed rest. They needed medical attention. They needed reorganization. They needed to be counted, directed, and sent onward. The evacuation was not tidy. It could not be. It was too large. Too urgent. Too improvised. But it worked. Not perfectly. Not without loss. But enough to change the course of what followed. And that is why Ramsgate's reception matters. Because a rescue does not only need boats. It needs places to land. It needs people ready to receive. It needs systems that can absorb shock. It needs towns that can become temporary gateways between war and home. Ramsgate became one of those gateways. Look again at the harbour. The boats today may sit quietly. The gulls may call. The tide may move gently against the wall. But in 1940 this same harbour carried a different sound. Engines. Footsteps. Orders. Coughing. Metal. Water. Voices. Maybe silence too. The silence of men too tired to speak. That silence is part of the story. Not every moment of history is loud. Some of it is quiet. A man sitting with a blanket around his shoulders. A cup held in both hands. A stare across the water. A thought he cannot finish. That is why the harbour matters. Because places hold what people cannot always say. In May 2026, when the little ships return to Ramsgate, visitors will see the vessels. They will see the flags. They will see the displays. They may hear music around the harbour. They may see families walking where exhausted men once came ashore. That contrast is not wrong. It is part of remembrance. Life continues. Harbours return to peace. Children walk where soldiers once landed. People take photographs where history once moved too quickly to be understood. But remembrance asks us to see both layers at once, the Ramsgate of today and the Ramsgate of 1940. The harbour view. And the human arrival. The festival. And the cost behind it. That is why this story belongs on Royal Harbour Live. Because the camera does not only show the present. It gives us a place to think about the past. If you are watching from another part of Britain, or from another country, this harbour is not just scenery. It is a witness. It witnessed vessels leaving. It witnessed men returning. It witnessed the town responding. It witnessed exhaustion, fear, relief, and survival. And when the little ships come home again in May 2026, they will return to a harbour that remembers. There is something deeply fitting about that. The vessels return not to a random marina. Not to a neutral backdrop. But to Ramsgate. A harbour that played its part. A harbour that received thousands. A harbour where the story came ashore. As Operation Dynamo continued, more men would be rescued. More ships would cross. More families would wait for news. More exhausted soldiers would pass through ports along the south coast. Ramsgate was one part of that wider effort. But it was a real part. A vital part. And for thousands of men, it was the first place where rescue became real. The moment a man stepped ashore, he was no longer only escaping. He had arrived. That arrival deserves to be remembered. Not just the departure from Dunkirk. Not just the crossing. Not just the boats. But the coming home. Because coming home is where survival becomes visible. If you're just joining us, you are watching Ramsgate Royal Harbour. This is Royal Harbour Live. And this is part 4 of our little ship's story. We have followed the harbour's past. The beginning of Operation Dynamo. The little ships themselves. And now, the return of men through Ramsgate. Part 4 is about the human landing. The moment when the sea journey ended, and the next chapter began. For some, that next chapter meant rest. For others, hospital. For many, reorganization and return to duty. For the country, it meant something larger. Britain had been shaken. But it had not lost its army. That fact changed everything. The evacuation did not end the danger. But it preserved the possibility of continuing the fight. And in that possibility, Ramsgate had a place. The harbour helped. The town helped. The people helped. And thousands came home through this water. When you look at the harbour now, let that stay with you. Not as a slogan. Not as exaggeration. But as memory. This was a place where rescue became arrival. You have been listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this has been part 4 of our little ship's story. Stay with us. Because next, we look at the legacy of Dunkirk, Ramsgate, and the little ships returning home in 2026. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 5 of our little ship's story. Memory returning home.